Okay, so today for Algebra 2, we're doing survey experiments and studies. We are going to start with the glossary words, the vocab words that they want us to do. I did decide, just for time's sake, not to be writing them while we start the video, because sometimes it's not a lot of vocab, sometimes it's a lot, like right now. And again, you already have the printout that I gave you from before, or not printout, but the PDF that I gave you guys from before, because it's the same vocab that's going to be throughout the whole semester on this Edmentum activities. So I've decided to not show you every time that I'm going to be writing the vocab word. So these are already written. I got them from the definitions that I once again already have given to you in a PDF. Also, what I did is I did chop some things off, like in almost all of the words it'll say in a statistical study. Well, we're studying statistics, so I just put in a study, just to kind of shorten it a little bit. Or if it would say something like the population data, I might just put the data because it already said population before, something like that. So I did shorthand some of it. So since this is a video that you can pause, I'm going to go by pretty quickly. So right now, if you want to pause and write down some of these words, you may. If you just want to be able to look them up if you need them. Again, this is just something to define the words as we're using them. It's not really necessary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this up, let you see the rest of them here. Again, if you want to pause it and be able to take some of these down, you may do that as well. And then start the video back up whenever you're ready. Or again, you may skip this part. And then there's just a couple more on the next page. Okay. So right there. Those are the last two vocab words. Again, if you want to pause it and write them down. And then finally, the objective is also already written in, because I don't want to waste time doing that. I'm just going to read it off and we're going to start from there. Okay, so we're going to start with the objective. In this lesson, you will identify and explain the purposes of randomized sample surveys, experiments, and observational studies. To be honest, this should be a pretty easy lesson, I hope, because although it gets a little bit wordy, it's repeating a lot of the same things that you should already know. And using some common sense, you know that some of these things can only be used in certain situations. So for example, by the end of this, you should be able to know that if you were trying to take, let's say, the result of someone smoking, which we'll see that like in one of the examples, it's unethical to do that in an experiment. You can't make someone smoke and then make someone not smoke. So if someone has never smoked in their life, that's unethical. You wouldn't want to conduct an experiment in that case. You might want to do an observational study where you get someone who already smokes, so you're not imposing that bad thing on them. They already smoke, and you're going to see the effects of, smoking has had on their lungs or something like that. So again, by the end of these lessons, tutorials, hopefully you will know what should you pick: a sample, a survey, an experiment, a study, so forth. Okay, so let's start with statistical studies. Statistical studies begin with a question. We then look for ways to collect data. So we must always have like a goal, that's the question, and then we start to collect data to help answer that question. After collecting the appropriate data, we organize and analyze. Put the L a little bit too quickly. Okay, analyze the data to draw valid conclusions and obtain answers. So what we're trying to say is it does no good to just collect data. We have to be able to take that data, do something with it, and draw conclusions with it. So that's part of the thing that you have to do with studies. There are 3 types of studies, and the first one has 2 blanks. The first one is observational study, which I mentioned. It's where you don't actually make a change. It's you're observing something that's already happening and you're collecting data on that. And then the next one is a survey, which is just what it says, a survey, collecting information, you know, a poll, a survey at the end of, you know, like the ones that you guys took for the school, or are you satisfied or not with your service that you received, you know, and so forth. Finally, an experiment. And this should be something you're familiar with because, again, most of you guys have already taken some sort of science and you've done experiments there. So you know what an experiment looks like. Basically, the biggest key factor to know the difference between this is if there's any sort of change that you are imposing, it's an experiment. If you are requiring people to respond to something based off of their knowledge, based off of their beliefs and so forth, that's a survey. And then finally, observational study, I already mentioned, was something where you observe what's going on and not necessarily impose a change on them. Okay, so an observational study, data is observed and collected by researchers based on what is seen and heard over time, without efforts to affect the responses collected. So you in no way are trying to manipulate any of the responses. You really shouldn't be ever, but in this case, you didn't do anything at all to bring any change. You're just observing and collecting data. A survey is an observational study in which a group is asked to respond to one or more questions. A poll is an example of a survey. The responding group in a survey is the sample in which provides data that is used to estimate characteristics of a population. Okay, so just to refresh that really fast. So a survey is a type of observational study because, again, you're not imposing anything in there. They're just putting their facts onto paper. The difference being with observational study, you look at what's going on and you record the data. In a survey, you give them the questions to fill out and so forth, or take a poll and things like that. When you do that, they're responding to the survey and you're using this to estimate the population's information. Okay, move on to the third page. So the last one that we have to study is an experiment. In an experiment, we impose a set of conditions called a treatment. So from this point forward, that change that is going to be happening is considered treatment or a variable upon subjects, and study the subject's responses. Okay, so the responses is how do they take to the pill, the change that we gave them, their response is what we record. The subject can be people, animals, or anything that can give a variable response. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people or animals, but it more than likely will be. There are other situations, like an example they give is a plant. When you impose something onto the plant and the plant grows a certain amount of height, that's a response. So it doesn't have to be people or animals, but it has to be something that we can measure and record. Okay, so I'll read that one again. So the subjects can be people, animals, or anything that can give a variable response. The basic idea of an experiment is to divide the subjects into groups, apply a variety of treatments to each group, or no treatment at all. That's called the control group, which we'll learn about. Then observe and record the responses as data. Okay, so the key difference between an experiment and an observational study is that in an experiment we have some effect on the subject. So we wrote the word affect, effect, but with an A before. So that's different. Here is we have some effect, it's with an E, because we can actually manipulate something, the treatment that's going in there. That is going to possibly affect what the outcome is. And that's the whole point. And we'll see, it doesn't talk about it much here, but you'll probably talk about it more in science class. You don't want to have like 7 variables. You want to have a controlled variable, you want to have a variable, but you also want to have something where everything is given a treatment a certain way, because if not, you're not going to know what variable gave you that result. So that is important. It's not really mentioned in these lessons, but it is something to keep in mind. An experiment will consist of 2 variables. The explanatory variable is the variable that we're testing. The response variable is what is observed in response to the treatment of the explanatory variable. The control group receives no value of the explanatory variable at all. Sometimes the control group receives a placebo. So placebo, some people have heard of like the placebo effect, where people think that there's a change and there's nothing actually going on. They gave them like a sugar pill or a pill with nothing in it just to get them to feel like they were taking something, but it didn't really affect anything. So a placebo is a fake dosage of a treatment. The reason they do that is because if you think you're getting a treatment, then versus not getting a treatment, then it might impose in some way the experiment. So what they try to do is everybody thinks they're getting the treatment, so everybody should act the same way. Nothing should be affected in that case. The only thing that you have to do is just monitor the results. In the end, you may know who had the placebo. Sometimes only the experimenter knows who has the placebo, and sometimes even they don't know. Like that was something that was withheld from them, and you don't find out until the very end. So that is another way to kind of control that, and that's something we'll learn a little bit further along. So this is a fake dosage of a treatment. The presence of a control group in an experiment is very important because it is necessary in order to make claims of causality, the control group's purpose is to establish a point of reference to measure any marked differences between the control group's response and other groups' responses in the experiment. So this is just reiterating what I just said. Basically, you want to have a controlled experiment. The fact that you have one that is not receiving the treatment will be able to compare your results to, this person received it, or these people received a treatment versus these who didn't, and the results compared are significantly more or less. You have to have something to compare it to. That is what the control group is there, and that's what causality is as well. Okay, so this is actually in the reading. There's like a little paragraph first, and then it goes into the question. So here is the question. So again, these are from the tutorial that you guys should have, eventually access or will access on Edmentum. And if you want to go along as you're doing this, you can. But I've gone ahead and just kind of written everything in. So this is in the reading. It's not just at the very top. So in the reading, it's got a little bit of a paragraph, and then it goes into this example, and it says, question, what is the effect of different durations of light on the growth of sunflower seedlings? So I kind of hinted at that before. 25 seeds randomly chosen from the package and placed into 3 separate containers. These are your subjects. So in this case, the plants are the subject. Treatments. Here are the treatments that they give. They either gave 24 hours of light, 12 hours of light, or 24 hours of darkness. This is another way of saying no light was administered. Okay, this is your control group because it's the one that did not receive any light. And what you are controlling in this case is how much light they are receiving. You measured and recorded their growth after 5 days. So the explanatory variable, if you go back to the top, it's the one that was testing. That was the sunlight. So we were controlling how much light they were receiving. The response variable is something else that's changing in the experiment, and that was their height. Now that was something that we controlled through the variable sunlight, and then because of that, the height was changing. Okay, so we move on to the next page. Okay, the purpose of an observational studies. Oh, before I move on, you can also try a question. So if you're in the tutorial at this point, I'm going to put the word question just up at the top. There is a question in the tutorial that if you want to try it, you can. It was a question over electric batteries. I don't want to give you the answer to those. I want you to actually try and see if you can work through them if you want. If not, you can also skip through them. But all that is It's a question over electric batteries, and I think it was saying they had a new chemical. They were trying to see which one would last more based off of that chemical. So you have to decide like what type of experiment it is or what the experiment's variable is and so forth. Okay, so if you do that, you could pause this video and try that activity. The purpose of observational studies and surveys is to collect information about characteristics of the target population. The data should be collected so that the sample is representative of the population. Okay. Determine the type of statistical studies described below. So before we move on this one, I do want to say this is going to look familiar if you are doing the activities, because this is another one of the questions that's going to get presented on there, but they don't go and give you all of the scenarios. So in the tutorial, they're going to give you like A through F. This was scenario A, this was scenario C, and this was scenario F. So they didn't give you all of them on this worksheet. They just gave you enough to where you had one of each kind. So they have observational, study, experiment, and survey. On the tutorial, there's a total of 6, so there's 2 of each kind, I believe. I don't remember exactly the others, but I think one of them said like a cafeteria and the kids come in and you ask them questions. I think that was a survey. So there are more examples than just these if you look online. Okay, so on this one, here's the situation. Then we're going to write is it, and we're going to go back to those 3 words that we learned at the beginning. Is it observational study, survey, or experiment? So that's what we're going to go back to. Those are the words we'll be using. Okay, so researchers compared crop production in counties in Texas that received above average or below average rainfall in a given year. So this is what I wrote kind of in my notes. We did not control, we did not administer the rainfall. So we did not make a change. Now, if we had said, we're going to place these inside and we're going to place these outside, that's different. But in this case, you're just going through and you're just collecting data of crops that had rainfall and didn't have rainfall. So because no treatment was imposed and the outcomes were just observed, then this is a or an observational study. Okay. To determine and compare the efficiency of fuel A and fuel B in racing cars, researchers randomly filled racing cars with one of the 2 fuels and compared the results. So here you are changing something. One car will receive fuel A, the other car will receive fuel B, and then you're going to see the results on them. You are controlling which fuel they get. So this has a treatment. The treatment is the fuel type, so this is an experiment. Anytime you administer some sort of change, which in this case we call a treatment, it's an experiment. Okay, a television station asked viewers to rate its television shows on a questionnaire posted on the website. So again, we're gathering information, just asking people to give their opinions and so forth. This is an example of a survey. So pretty simple, hopefully, to determine those. Okay, randomization and bias. Randomization is key when it comes to collecting data. So you don't just want to collect willy-nilly just any data. Your data has to be has some certain control to it. If it doesn't have a good representation of the whole population, that data is misconstrued and, to be honest, should not be used at all. So randomization is key when it comes to collecting data from any kind of statistical study, which we've already talked about before. What are the things that shouldn't happen? So randomization is going to help with these purposes. It's going to help avoid bias. It's going to protect against unknown factors. It's going to allow us to draw inferences about a population through a sample. Oops, I just realized you can't see what I just said. Let me push this up. Copy that down. I'm going to just repeat it since it wasn't fully visible. Randomization is key when it comes to collecting data from any kind of statistical study And when you have those two things in place, it's going to help avoid bias, unknown factors. It's going to help you make inferences through a sample. If a study isn't random, we allow bias to interfere with the validity of the results. Okay. And while I explain that, I'll let you guys copy if you needed to copy anything there. So what this is saying is, if you do not allow bias to not happen, you're not making it random. You're making it to where, and I'm just going to pick the first 10 people that walk in. They use an example in the reading that says they're going to pick randomly 25 people, I think is what they said, out of the phone book, and they're going to call them in the morning and ask them what they think of a presidential candidate. The issue with that is you're not going to get a fair representation of the population. The example they gave is you're mainly going to have, probably more than likely, elderly people who are at home with a phone, because the phone book will mainly list landline phones. More people that are younger but could possibly vote will probably be using a cell phone, and they may work in the morning. So you're probably going to get a population sample of mainly elderly people who are at home, probably retired, and have a landline phone. Now, obviously, that might not be the case, but that's more than likely what's going to happen. It doesn't give you a fair representation. So when that happens, your data is misconstrued, and it's not truly good data. Okay, so we're going to move on to the sources of bias. So on this one, I did put on my key that you may now try the question tutorial. It had a vocab review, so it kind of had like a matching thing, I think, where you had to put the vocab in there. So you may try that. And then after a few slides, you get to another question about asthma. So if you want to go through those, you may. If you're kind of watching these at the same time, you could pause this and try to go to that. I'm going to go ahead and jump on ahead to sources of bias. So if you are looking at this and trying to see what the next one is, when you get to the slide, it'll say sources of bias. That's how you know you're in the right place. Okay, so after a couple of slides, we get to this, and we have non-responsive bias. This bias occurs when people don't respond to a survey, and I think a lot of us are guilty of that. Any type of survey for which a response is voluntary is at risk for non-responsive bias. So lots of times they tell us to take this survey, do this, blah, blah, blah. A lot of us just throw it away. We need to try to avoid that if you are doing some sort of survey. So basically they said, for example, you go to McDonald's, Wendy's, so forth, and there's a survey on the back, and it says, please take this survey and you'll get like a free McChicken or something. Now that is an incentive to say, here is my review of the place or my experience, but mainly you only get two types of responses. Either you had a really wonderful experience and you're going to comment on it, or you had a really bad experience and you're going to comment on it and complain. Usually that's the only time that you're going to respond to those types of surveys. Most of us will not respond to just, it was okay, the service was fine, it's what I expected, and keeps going. So for that reason, they're biased in a way that you only got responses from the extreme sides of it. Another one that they showed in the reading is, like if you put a survey at the exit of the museum, you might not get those back. People are exiting the museum, so you might not get those responses back. Now, if it had something maybe to say, please respond in the next 30 days and you'll get 10% off, blah, 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 something like that, maybe it'll impose them to try to get that back to you. Okay, another kind of bias is undercoverage. This bias occurs when the frame the sample is selected from isn't an accurate representation of the population being studied. So we kind of talked about this before. Basically, you didn't have a wide enough sample. The sample that you're taking had too little, and so forth, and that's going to be undercoverage. Unclear wording. So question wording should be clear, simple, and easy to interpret. If people misinterpret questions on a survey, the results of the survey will not be accurate. So for example, if you use some very medical terms and things like that, when you're just trying to ask, did they take a vitamin, but you name it by its scientific name and they might not respond to that very well. Not everybody is familiar with the same type of vocabulary. So it needs to be easy, it needs to be clear, it needs to be simple to help avoid that. Bias can also arise in experiments in which randomization doesn't help to avoid. So there's some times where we can't avoid these things happening. Here are things that they use for that. So if the subject know they are receiving a treatment, they may have a psychological response that interacts with the responses observed. So this kind of goes back to that placebo effect, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit here. So if the subject knows they're receiving a treatment, it might make them act a certain way, and we don't want that. Also, if the doctor knows they're administering something, sometimes they might read the results a little bit skewed. So sometimes not even the doctor or the people controlling kind of the experiment know. They don't find that out until later. If a doctor knows which subject receives this specific treatment and which did not, it might interfere with the manner in which the doctor observes the subject's response. There are several ways to minimize or completely avoid this bias. One way is to use blinding, where the subjects, I'll rewrite that, where the subjects of the experiment are kept from knowing the conditions of their treatment. So this is that placebo effect. They do not know if they're getting the treatment or if they're the placebo group, the control group. They don't know. Double blinding is when not only the people receiving the treatment don't know, so the people involved in this study are blinded, but also the researchers don't know the conditions of the treatments administered to the subject. So both of them are blinded. That's why it's called double blinding. Okay, then we move on. So again, we'll write on here, there is a question that if you choose to do, you may, but we're gonna move on to making conclusions from the studies. So there are many things to consider before we can draw a valid conclusion, or we can draw valid conclusions from studies. Was the study randomized? Is bias a concern? Was the best type of study used to collect the data? So just to kind of summarize that, randomized means you didn't, just pick someone because you like them. You randomized the study. You randomized the people that you chose. There was a method that you did that. Is bias a concern? So again, that type of thing where we're not only going to ask the rich, or we're not going to only ask the gym goers if they drink vitamin or take vitamins, because that's not a good representation of the population. That's a good representation of the gym population, but not maybe, let's say, all of Shelbyville. So again, you have to figure out if you've used bias or not. And then finally, was the best method used to collect the data? So what this is saying is, should you have used a survey and instead you used an experiment, and so forth. So we kind of already talked about when you should use which. Okay, move on to the last piece. And this is causality is present when one variable is known to cause a certain effect in another variable. So again, these are things that usually happen because of that variable. It's not something that we can control, but it does happen because of that variable at times. When a study is conducted in the most appropriate way with randomization, and methods to reduce bias are put in place, The result of the study can be used to draw inferences and conclusions about the population. So as long as those things go hand in hand, then you'll be fine and you shouldn't have to worry about your data. It's going to be good data. So again, I'm just going to put on here, there is one last question that you are allowed to answer if you want, and it talks about appropriate versus non-appropriate studies. Kind of talked about like the whole smoking thing. Like you don't want to make people smoke that don't smoke. That would be more of an observational study versus an experiment type thing. So in summary, what are the different ways you can do studies? So 1, and there's no particular order for them, is experiment. 2 is observational study. And then 3, the other one we talked about was a survey. The one we probably talked about the least was survey, and I think it's because it's the one that you don't really have to study too much about. So I guess that's why it was kind of left off of this paper. Okay, so that is it. The last thing I'm going to show you is something that I will link on there. I think it was one of the activities or something where it had you go to like one of these links and it talked about surveys and stuff like that. So I'll link this one on there. It's a very short read if you do want to read it. But again, most of the activities and questions I just glance over and skip over, so you should be fine. Okay, so just to review, surveys, experiments, and studies is the section you should be on. So just remember, you should try your best. Get the mastery test done on that. I am going back, and if I've seen that you attempted it, 7 times and you can't get past a 60, I'm going to bump that up to a 70 and get you that mastery. So once it has that little star filled in, it's a mastery. If you email me and tell me, hey, I've tried this 3 or 4 times, I'll go and look and I'll be able to see that. Now, if it's the first time you tried it and it shows me you were only on it 5 minutes and you got a 30 on it or a 20 on it, I'm not going to give you the mastery test. So try your best, do it. If it's locked out, at the end of every day, I go back in and I unlock mastery test. But if it's something that you want to do right that second, send me an email. Send me a message on the Remind app and I'll try to unlock it at that moment. Try your best, and I'll see you for the next video.